Okay, so as is the way sometimes, unfortunately, the recording didn't work for the first 1 and a little bit of minutes. So basically this, what you're seeing here is the recording of the first half of the class. First question was whether or not, multiple choice question. 3 main categories of implied terms are accepted in common law, including terms implied by law, by custom and in fact. What is another category of implied terms that has been acknowledged by the courts? Interestingly, this was one of the most difficult questions for students. So you'll see that at the moment, this is the time where they would be participating. By the way, these terms are available for you if you weren't in class, or these quiz questions as a quiz. So go through and have a go yourself. And we should flick over, you'll see the answer in a minute. Hopefully you've written down what it is that you thought it should have been. You can see absolutely nobody got this one right. Basically, terms implied by legislation, that's not a common law term. And the implied terms by legislation, they are a legislative term, not a common law term as such. Terms implied by notice, I don't actually even understand really what that means. They're express terms if they're implied by notice. And, well, when the narration picks up, you'll find me talking about terms implied by good faith. Don't forget to ask me any questions and, yeah, enjoy. Cheers.
Hit the go button. Terms implied by good faith. I don't even think that's a sensible sentence. So there, we will explore whether or not there is an implied term to act in good faith, but a term that's implied by good faith. If somebody has good faith, that implies a term of some sort, not really consistent with what we're talking about. Terms implied by notice also doesn't really make any sense to me. A term, and there'll be an express term in a notice, so it's not implied by the notice, it's a term that is expressed on the notice. So the next one, I mean, it's kind of by process of elimination, an implied duty to act reasonably. Where have we seen that happen? We have seen it happen in relation to cases where the only sensible reading of a provision was to imply a requirement to act reasonably. So the Hunter Valley Chilling and Freezing Company one, the Hunter Valley Council and the Chilling and Freezing Company, the clause basically talked about, there was a clause under construction, talked about whether or not the electricity provider could charge extra charges, what they were. And so, and the court's basically looking at it saying, well, actually we can read this in a sensible way. It doesn't actually give you a blanket ability to just change your charges. We're going to imply that you're acting reasonably and that there's a reasonable nexus between the change in the end charge and the change in your costs. So we've seen that happen a couple of times already. So all right, we're going to improve from here, or I'm going to be calling a tute in the middle of the week after last night. So, yeah, that's just order of response time for what it's worth. Implied terms cannot be excluded by parties to a contract. True or false? You ready? Go. Okay, 13 of you, so I'm thinking everybody's submitted. Did I miscount? Implied terms can, on the whole, be excluded by the parties to a contract. Terms that are implied by statute, in a very small number of circumstances, the statute will say you can't contract out of this. So we'll talk about that in connection with the Australian consumer law. But as a general rule, where we have a term or a particular reading that would be implied by law, by fact or circumstances, if the parties specifically exclude that. So again, we've seen that happen a couple of times already. We know about the postal exception to the communication rule. So, which effectively says if you send a communication by post, it's deemed to be received by the person it's sent to at the time it's posted, not at the time that it actually arrives. Instantaneous communications are dealt with differently. It is very, very common to include in a contract document notices that are sent by post are deemed to be received 3 days after they're posted. Because what the parties are doing is trying to make sure that the rule as it would apply as a matter of law is excluded. One of the things that you will have seen in a couple of the cases with the reading this week talked about time being of the essence. Again, a law, as a matter of custom and law, if you have to do something by a certain time, that is generally a condition. It's of the essence. But parties can specifically say time is not of the essence unless it relates to blah, 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 or ever. Tracy up there very quickly again, but she has some competition. It's even all the way down there. English decision of the Moorcock. Sorry, this software will not let me italicise. The English Court of Appeal held that the jetty owners were liable for damages. That apostrophe is in the wrong spot, that's annoying. Why was that held? Moorcock? Everybody remember what it was about? I can remind you if you need to. We have these options. Breach of an implied term requiring the owners to take reasonable care. The owners were in breach of an express term anyway. The owners were in breach of a term implied by custom, or the owners were in breach of an implied term in fact requiring them to take reasonable care. Zero. Okay, most of you are on track with that. Implied by custom, neither of these are the dumb version of the incorrect answer. So while we're here, let's talk about the Moorcock. Does anybody remember what happened in that case? You want to share?
Yeah, there's two parties. One was, I think, a jetty.
Yep, the jetty owners.
The jetty owners, and then there was a boat owner, I believe.
Yep.
And the boat owner wanted to moor their boat on the jetty,
and it's on the Thames, isn't it? It was a tidal river of some sort.
Yeah, and there was low tide and high tide, and during the low tide, the ship would rest on the bottom of the river.
Yep, on the riverbed.
Usually that would be fine, but this part of the river was quite hard and rocky, and it damaged the boat.
Yep.
And then it was implied by fact that it was reasonable or responsible. The jetty owners were responsible for checking whether or not it was safe.
So the court looked at the whole of the circumstances and said, actually, the ship owners are coming in and out. The jetty owners are there every day. They're making money by providing a safe place. That's what they do, provide a safe place for you to moor your boat while you're loading and unloading. And they were in a position to check the bottom. Because of the size of this boat and the size of boats that they accepted at this jetty, and because of the knowledge of the river, it was inevitable that the bottom of the boat would touch the riverbed. And so the court found, as a matter of fact, there was an implied term that they would warn if for some reason the riverbed wasn't suitable. So this is quite an old case, but it's drawn on subsequently when Denning talks about this idea of the officious bystander. So that if you asked an officious bystander, well, what would happen if the tide went out so far that the boat ended up on the riverbed, whose responsibility would it be to make sure that the riverbed was safe? And everybody would say, well, of course, it would be the jetty owner. Like, it goes without saying, which is part of that test in the Moorcock, which comes through in the Australian equivalent, which is the BP Petroleum case, that lists out each of the requirements. Nice work, thank you. Is it possible to imply a term in fact in an informal contract? Yep, provided the court strictly adhere to BP refinery. No, only if there's a formal contract. No, a term can only be implied by custom. Yes, a flexible approach has been recommended by the High Court. Okay, again, half of you are in the right place. Strict adherence to BP is more relevant when you've got a written document, because they will strictly look at each of the requirements in BP. And when you think about the logic of that, it makes sense. When we've got a written agreement that appears on the face of it to be an entire agreement, the courts are reluctant to go out and find terms elsewhere and bring them in, particularly terms that are a matter of fact. So I think it's that the court's strict adherence. So the issue with the test there is it's less strictly applied when we've got an informal arrangement. In fact, the next question is going to help me with this a little bit more. I'm thinking that's Fabian there taking the lead. Few people catching up though. Bonus one. Can you cite a case to support the principles that a flexible approach has been recommended by the High Court to the implication of terms in informal contracts? I will give you some choices. Hospital Products, Service Station Association, Burger King, or CBA and Barker, sorry. All of these are cases that you should have read for this week. Or at least come across in the readings. Three, two, one. Hospital Products. I'm working on the basis it was a bit of guessing lottery there. To be fair, actually the reason I put this in is because Hospital Products is not actually in the reading. But this is a case that comes up over and over again. We notice it as support for a number of different principles along the way. And it led in some senses to sort of reinvigoration of this question about whether or not there's an implied duty of good faith, and really signifies this sort of move in. I know this was decided when I was at law school, Hospital Products, and it had this shift a little bit more towards the American idea of good faith, and opened up that idea potentially of some gross negligence, but then shut it down again.
Is this specifically for informal contracts?
Yeah, for informal contracts, that's right. Good work, people. Terms implied in law is not a closed class of implied terms. New implied terms in law are added to this class provided certain conditions are met. What are their conditions? This time you might get more than one correct answer. Well, there might be more than one correct answer here, but you unfortunately can only select one, so go for the one you think is most correct. New term must be based on the presumed intention of the parties. The new term must relate to a definitive class of contract. The new term must encompass a duty of good faith. The new term must be able to be implied in all contracts of a particular type, or the particular type. Ready to move on? Oh, again, a bit of a spread. New terms need to relate to a definitive class of contracts. So all of the cases that you've looked at will address what kind of contract is this. Is this an employment contract? Is this a contract to do with shipping? And so particularly when we're looking at, the rules are very similar across terms implied by law, terms implied by fact, and terms implied by custom. But we've got to see, is there a class of contract that this fits into, and would this term apply every time in that class, unless it's specifically avoided? And so basically these are two sides to the same coin. The new term must relate to a definitive class of contract, and then it must be able to be implied across all contracts of that type. A number of principles were outlined in the decision of Constant Industries in Australia and Norwich for implying a term based on custom. Which of the following principles were summarised? Again, more than one might apply. A person will not be bound by custom if they don't have any knowledge of it. It's a question of fact if a certain custom or usage of terms exists. It's a question of fact if a certain custom or usage of... How are they different? Usage of... I've got the same thing in there twice. The term may be inconsistent with the express term of the contract provided that the parties are unaware of it. That's me cutting and pasting from my other quiz. I wonder what I've done. I'm just waiting for them to... At least they're both correct. But I'm going to go with 100% on that one, really. One day I'm going to get one of these quizzes and actually not have an own goal in there somewhere. Okay, so constant is actually a really useful case. I've put that one in, I spent a bit of time with that in one of the desk lectures, so I won't spend too much time here. But again, we basically get this circular test. We can look at each of the elements and we need to work out whether or not there is, it's been met. So the interesting thing with custom is it has to be effectively a ubiquitous custom, but at the same time, it doesn't matter if somebody didn't know about it. And Constant's kind of interesting there because they argued that in insurance brokerage contracts is this ubiquitous term, that things are always done this way, but then also argued, well, it didn't matter that the customer didn't know that. But at the end of the day, I'm so glad I didn't sneeze into your ears, my lovely people at home in your jammies. That could have been just tragic. So, but at the end of the day, what's important here is that often terms that are implied by customs fit in really discrete areas where lots of people do it all the time, but the industry is a complete anathema to other people who don't know anything about it. So insurance is a good example, port brokerage, stock brokerage, things like that, where contracts are done the same way all the time, and there are really good efficiency and good reasons why those contracts should have similar terms. But if you're an outsider, you wouldn't necessarily have any idea what brokerage meant. Are you trying to ask me a question? I don't know. Just checking. Again, a little bit of movement. Don't know who I is, but I is climbing. High Court has unanimously held that Australian courts should accept a duty of good faith in the performance of contractual obligations. Yep or no? True or false? Green or red? Oh, some people are going real fast here. Okay, 13 is the highest number I've had, so I'm just going to move it on. That is false. So the High Court has definitely not made this finding at all. However, particularly the Supreme Court of New South Wales is quite keen on this idea. So we have this very interesting balance at the moment where the matter is, well, depending on, if you only read High Court judgments, you would probably think it is settled because the High Court says, well, we don't need to decide that. There are other reasons to decide it. We'll talk about it today. But at the end of the day, the lower courts have, in most states, particularly New South Wales, but not in Victoria, found a duty of good faith. Oh, you're taking an astonishing lead there, Fabian. I think you're unbeatable, except for the fact we're going to do consumer terms next, and we'll find out whether or not you are a shopper.
The hospital products was a guess.
Yeah, nobody else has guessed anything, right? So we should penalise him. The duty of good faith has been regarded as an implied term by the courts. What type of implied term is it? Again, more than one might apply. Is it implied in fact, in law, a term of reasonableness, a term implied in custom, or is this a trick question? The High Court has not definitively determined whether a duty of good faith can be implied in Australia. Pick one of these. Fact or law? The courts, it's a little bit euphemistic. I thought I could give you the trick question. If it had said the High Court, the last would have applied. Good faith has not been ever found to be a customary term. So basically we're looking at, is it implied in fact, or does the law in this particular class of contracts require some sort of good faith element? Courts have identified a number of standards by which good faith can be measured to ensure that the exercise of good faith takes into account the interests of the other party to the contract. Which of the following are recognised standards? Are you ready? Cooperation, reasonableness, legitimate interest, sensibility, not to exercise a contractual power capriciously. There are a number that might apply in this circumstance. If you do the quiz, you only get 4 points if you actually choose them all. These are the quizzes I've been doing on Canvas, because I've been trying to make sure our friends who are in OUA or unable to come get the opportunity to have as much fun as you do not appear to be having right now. But I actually have not worked out a way to find out whether people do the quizzes or not. So if anybody is actually doing them, do tell me if they work. It would be good. Okay, reasonableness, legitimate interests, and not to exercise a contractual power capriciously have all been standards that good faith has been measured against. So in fact, the High Court has said a number of times, we don't need to answer this question about whether there's a duty of good faith because there is already a term implied in law or in fact that, or even expressly, that requires reasonableness or requires a legitimate interest to be found or prevents the exercise of a contractual power in a capricious way. Tracy, you've taken him out at last. Well done. In the decision of Burger King and Hungry Jack's, court considered if the, I always want to say whether, it's old-fashioned, isn't it? If the implied duty of good faith should stop a party from exercising contractual power capriciously. What did the Supreme Court of New South Wales hold? Whilst there is support in the US for this view, it's not supported in Australian courts. No such duty existed. The franchisor had breached its duty of good faith by deliberately preventing the franchisee from performing its duties under the contract, or the franchisee breached its duty of good faith by not performing its contractual duties. Couple of people missed out. So this is the New South Wales decision, and this is where New South Wales has sort of taken off its own little approach to doing this differently. And they found that there was a duty of good faith in that case. So we'll have a look at the case when we keep moving on. By the way, I'm just talking here and wandering around the room. If anybody has questions or concerns or wants to argue with me, I'm very open to that. Oh, eyes taken up there as well. The battle is on. Consumer guarantee law introduced consumer guarantees that replaced terms that provided for minimum quality standards in contracts with consumers for the supply of goods and services. So these terms are implied by legislation. The Trade Practices Act 1974 was one such act that implied these terms. Is that true or is it false? People being very quick here. Yeah, I think we might have everybody now. It is true. So again, why do we keep on reminding you about an act that is now, you know, it's been out of circulation for close to 10 years, maybe more. It's because there is so much law based on the provisions of this act and the provisions that you are dealing with. Actually, the guarantee ones are slightly different in some important ways, but some of the key terms are exactly the same. And Section 18 of the Australian Consumer Law, which used to be Section 52 of the Trade Practices Act, is the most litigated piece of legislation, section of legislation in Australia, and that's unlikely to change in the near future. Oh, there was a very dramatic up and down there. Didn't get to see who it was. In determining if goods or services were purchased by a consumer, which of the following will be taken into consideration? Once again, more than one might be right. Goods cost less than $100,000. Goods purchased are used ordinarily for domestic consumption. If the goods or services exceed the amount of $40,000. If the vehicle purchased is used mainly for transporting goods on private roads, or if the trailer acquired is used mainly for transporting goods on public roads. Some of those things fit within what it means to be a consumer, and some of them don't. This was the safe bet and the good one. Goods purchased ordinarily for domestic consumption. But it's also very good to remember this $40,000. Doesn't matter what it was for, what kind of goods they are. If they're under that cap, the ACL applies to them. So it's very easy to think it's a consumer transaction. This particular transaction relates to something to do with somebody's business. But if the amount is under that $40,000 threshold, it's going to be covered by this Act for the most part. And if it's normally for domestic consumption, then, you know, $250,000 worth of toilet paper is likely to be covered by the ACL. You're looking perturbed, no? Oh, she's on fire. The guest is moving up too, whoever the guest in our midst is. The supply of financial services and financial products are regulated under the Australian Consumer Law and also the ASIC Act. Is this true or is it false? Go for it. Speed helps here. It is false. It's not regulated under both, it's regulated under the ASIC Act. The provisions are identical. But if we're talking about financial services or financial products, they're carved out of the Australian Consumer Law and they're covered by the ASIC Act instead. Thinking there, this could upset our apple cart here, maybe. Oh, K, Kay, that was Kay. Did very well there, nice work. Consumer guarantees under the Consumer Guarantees legislation do not apply to goods purchased at auctions and subsequently do not apply to goods purchased online from websites such as eBay. Is that true or is that false? Oh, people were very quick in there. It is false. The first part of that is true. They don't apply to goods purchased at auctions. However, eBay and other online auction sites are carved out of that because they are seen as platforms, not as agency arrangements because of the way that they have been put together. So buying your stuff online in an eBay auction, you have still the same protections that you otherwise might have had under the Act. Actually, while we're here, because I'm doing all the talking, why would you carve out sales by auction from other types of transactions from the Australian consumer law and from the guarantees? You look like you have an idea, Bill. Why would you do that?
Auction. I'm just thinking auction sale of land act.
Well, we're talking about goods or services here, so let's not think about land auctions for the time being, but we can learn, we can be informed for that. I was pining over Mother's Day. I like to have a theory of everything, and I was, my mother-in-law was talking about the 5 languages of love or something like that. We all have our love language. I've decided we have a curiosity language. I'm a why curiosity person. Like when I don't understand something, I want to know why. My husband is a how curiosity person. He wants to know how things work. My mother-in-law only wants to know who did what, when, like that. I think who, what, when is like the least interesting part of it. But why? I think the more you guys ask why, how is good too, but why would you have this carve out? It will inform your thinking as you're solving problems. And it stopped people talking about really boring things over Mother's Day lunch to talk about that instead. Okay, I'm going to leave that one with you. We'll come back to it for the conversation because I think that's an interesting question. Why would you carve out auctions? If there's been a minor failure by a supplier to comply with some consumer guarantees, what remedies are available? Again, more than one might be correct here. Repair, replacement, rejection, recover compensation for the diminution of value in the goods, or terminate the arrangement altogether. So we can repair things, we can replace them. What's key in this question is this word minor failure. So the way that the remedies tend to work is a bit like when we're thinking about innominate terms. That termination or rejection outright, or even some kind of compensation, those are remedies that are more relevant when you have a significant issue. Compensation itself is pretty rare. You would probably need to find not only was there a breach of the guarantee, but that as a consequence of that guarantee breach, that there was some sort of damage that in tort or otherwise. But yep, in theory at least, I should be able to get the heels on my boots fixed. In what circumstance will a consumer not be permitted to reject goods under the ACL, the Australian Consumer Law? So you're not permitted to reject. More than one might apply.
if the consumer has lost the goods, if the supplier has lost the goods, if the supplier has damaged the goods, if the period for rejecting the goods has ended, or the goods have been incorporated into real property and cannot be removed without damaging the goods or the real property for that matter. So, in what circumstances will a consumer not be permitted to reject goods under the ACL? We ready? Yeah, so basically there was only one there where you can reject, where they've been damaged. Not being able to reject, when they're lost, that's kind of odd, but you've got nothing to reject. Okay, so there's just a complete failure of delivery there. Oh, I taking a towards the end lead. Good to see. If goods are not of an acceptable quality, do not comply with an express warranty made by the manufacturer, or do not meet the description, the consumer is permitted to obtain damages from the manufacturer. True or false? Okay, I think everybody's in there. That is true. We've got a wholesale abandonment of the provisions. And we're done. Yay. Who was that? Who came up last at the end? I? Yay, go Tom. Well done. Go on, cheer him on. Don't be sore losers. Okay, questions, concerns, frustrations, compliments. Wouldn't it be nice if we had music with that? I do know that the Kahoots are more fun. They're just so much harder to put together. Please.
In terms of auctions, is it because auctions can be more than $40,000?
Auctions can be more than $40,000. In fact, you've got no idea before the auction starts, really, in theory, what the price is going to go to. Though, you know, if I'm auctioning that computer mouse, you can probably guess. Anybody else got an idea about auctions? Think about what the nature of an auction is. So the way the transaction works is you've agreed a set of terms up front, and then there is basically a process by which bidders come together and fight over the terms. Yeah. So basically, and again, the logic in it really is that all of the terms need to be contained in the invitation to treat. And if you were going to imply terms in that particular way, then you either have to be all in or all out. So by having everything contained in the invitation to treat, then all bidders are working on an even playing field. I think that's the logic behind it, but there are some weird things in there. Like there's what I call, for no reason by the way, and one day I'm actually going to do the research to find out why it's there, but I call it the Lindsay Fox exemption, that trailers that can go on private roads or certain types of trucks fall outside of the ACL regime when you just think there's no particular reason why they should when others would fall in. And it's just, I reckon it's just lobbying.
Yeah, is that even for business trucks? Like
yeah.
Commercial?
Yeah. So where you would have, where otherwise it would fit in or would not fit in, can't actually remember off the top of my head which way it goes. I've got a slide that actually addresses it. But it just seems to me to be lobbying. And when you think about how laws are made, like laws are, and we're going to have an election next weekend. And I don't know, have any of you done a vote compass thing? Like I've got no idea what to do with what my results are. But in the end, I'm going to pick a party and I'm going to vote for it. And I know there's some general platform things that they agree with. But if a law is going to change, then unless they have an outright majority, whichever party gets in, which in Australia has not happened for a very long time, then any law that comes in is going to require bipartisan support, or it's going to need crossbenchers to support it or whatever. And then you get different single issues just pop in. So not all legislation makes absolute sense. Somebody who actually couldn't come to class tonight asked me a question today about, like, how do you know if a law's been applied by statute? I thought it was a really good question. It's like, do you have to go through every statute, or will it be really obvious? And it kind of has to be obvious, doesn't it? It's like the statute itself will say, in contracts of this type, this type of, and so that's how the ACL works. Consumer contracts, we define it by reference to what a consumer is. Doesn't use the definition you or I would agree. Like, we know what a consumer transaction looks like when we see it, don't we? And we know a business transaction when we see it, but defining that is quite hard to do. And so our definition is, well, anything with a value of under $40,000, or that would be normally for domestic consumption, plus all of these other odd sort of single issue things that come in. We rarely end up with really nice, clean laws when it comes from legislation, is what I'm saying. Kate, I look like I'm worrying you. Yeah. Have I disrupted your thoughts about democracy, or, you know, I just say bring it on, where we just vote as we go. It would be so much more interesting. All right, I'm going to put a slide pack up. We've been here for an hour. Stretch your legs. Let's take a 5-minute break. You two at home. And we will move on. It won't be long.